Hey, everybody. Welcome to Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. It's episode 120 of the podcast, and we're back from the NHL Scouting Combine. And obviously, there's always a lot to talk about coming out of the Combine. We wrote about it. We're going to talk about it. We've got a lot of listener questions. We're also going to talk about the history that was made in the ECHL over the weekend, because let me tell you, more people need to be talking about how crazy what the Florida Everblades just did is. And we'll get to that in just a second. But before we do all of that, I want to remind you on Talking Hockey Sense, you can catch us on your podcast app of choice. Make sure you download, subscribe, rate, and review wherever we are. It helps a lot to get it out there. It's been a while since we got some 5-star reviews. We haven't gotten enough reviews. Get them in there. Help us out. It's draft season. If this podcast has helped you get into the draft a little bit more, or help you learn a little bit more about the draft, or maybe impress your friends and relatives about your unending NHL draft knowledge, well then please leave us a 5-star rating and a kind review on your podcast app of choice, particularly Apple Podcasts. That seems to be the one that everybody likes to use the most. But hey, there, Spotify, wherever you find the podcast. Also, you can watch every episode of Talking Hockey Sense on FloHockey or via the Flow Sports app. You can also catch us on the FloHockey YouTube page, where there is a ton of NHL Scouting Combine content. We interviewed probably 30 different prospects and have video interviews with all of them. You can get to learn guys that'll go in the first round, guys that'll go maybe in the later rounds, guys that'll be early day 2 picks, or maybe some players that you're curious about. We are continually uploading those, so make sure you get over to our YouTube page and FloHockey.tv, where there is a lot of that. But before we get back to the NHL draft, and we'll spend most of our time there, but I got to talk about this because this is really one of the most impressive things we've seen in hockey. And that is the Florida Everblades on Saturday night became the first time three-peat champions in the ECHL. 3 consecutive titles won in the ECHL. It had never happened before. They are the Kelly Cup champions. There was the Riley Cup before there was the Kelly Cup, and no one had ever won 3 in a row. Now the Florida Everblades have done it. So what makes that special? Well, there's a great story from our own Justin Cohn on FloHockey right now that just talks about how hard it is to win consecutively in leagues like the ECHL. There are so many factors at play for a coach, for a general manager, for most teams, that is the same person. And so there are a lot of different things that come into play that make it really difficult to go back to back to back as Florida did. One of them is roster turnover. There are only 3 players that were part of all 3 championships. And so you see that where you can't keep roster continuity. There are all sorts of things that change. You'll have affiliation changes where your NHL team is sending players to different places. That wasn't a problem for Florida. The Everblades have been with the Florida Panthers for a little bit now, and so that helps where you get that kind of continuity there. However, there's free agency. There's always the possibility that players want to go play in Europe. There are guys that will leave in the middle of the season. There's a lot of different things that kind of come into play. There are injuries as well, as happens at every level of hockey. But the Florida Everblades won 3 consecutive championships. Oliver Chow was the MVP of the tournament. He has won championships in the AJHL, the NCAA, and now 2 in the ECHL. So Oliver Chow, the former UMass standout who played alongside Cale Makar back in the day, he is the MVP. The Everblades also won Game 5 on home ice. They had 3 consecutive games on home ice after splitting the first 2 at Kansas City. They won 3 straight at home. And in Game 5, with the possibility of them not celebrating on their home ice and not being able to return until they had potentially won the Kelly Cup, they come back from a 3-1 deficit in the third period, score with about 1:47 left in the regulation. It was a crazy bounce. And then they win it early in overtime to celebrate on home ice and send everybody home happy and end the series on Saturday night. And boy, it was just impressive. And the guy that I think a lot of people will be talking about more and more now is head coach Brad Ralph. He is only the second ECHL coach in the league's history to win 3 championships. So he will have his name on the Kelly Cup 3 different times. John Brophy won it back when it was the Riley Cup when he was with Hampton Roads, and he won 3 championships over the span in the 1990s. So what Brad Ralph did is really impressive. He is a name that I think you're going to hear a lot more in coach openings when we're talking about the openings in the AHL, different levels. Maybe there's a chance for him to one day become an NHL assistant coach. Paul Maurice, the head coach of the Florida Panthers, has said that he's leaned on Brad Ralph for some of the things that he did to win the championship in the Kelly Cup. So really, really impressive. And I think we need to really focus on how special it is what was done in Estero, Florida. The teams in Florida and in the South in the ECHL generally have an easier time recruiting because they are places where people want to play and live. But you still have to do it, and you still have to win 4 rounds. They have won 12 consecutive playoff rounds. That is an ECHL record, of course, because nobody had ever won 2 or more than 2 in a row. They had already had the record with 11 consecutive wins. Now they have the 12, and it is going to be remarkable. Now, will they do it again? Can they go for the four-peat? I mean, geez, there's really seems to be no slowing this team down. They didn't have a great regular season, but then they go and they have a tremendous postseason. That's what we see from the Florida Everblades. So if you haven't yet, go check out the archive. We have the highlights for the entire game, extended highlights, including the championship celebration and trophy presentations on FloHockey.tv. You can subscribe and get the archive of the game as well. So, excuse me. And so as we get that going, I hope that you guys check that out because it is really impressive. Also, Josh Ho-Sang, former first-round pick of the New York Islanders, is a Kelly Cup champion. We saw Cam Darcy, who broke his leg in the previous round. He got a tour of the ice on a folding chair, pushed around by his teammates to celebrate with the Kelly Cup. It was do it for Darcy. So Cam Darcy, who was a solid player in his own right back in the day and now has continued that with the ECHL, was able to celebrate. So lots of great stories on that team. Justin Cohn has a great story up on FloHockey about just how crazy it is to win 3 straight in the ECHL. So make sure you check that out. And once again, congratulations to the Florida Everblades and congratulations to the ECHL, a record season on FloHockey in terms of viewership. So the league is growing, things are going great, and we are really, really excited to continue our partnership with the ECHL as it was announced just a few weeks back that we will continue being the exclusive streaming home of the ECHL, the premier AA hockey league in the world. So we will keep that going. All right. Now we're going to talk more about the NHL draft because I was at the Scouting Combine with Liz Child on our team here from Flow Sports. We got a ton of interviews. We talked to a lot of players. I talked to team personnel as well. We got to look at players during physical testing. I mean, it's always an interesting couple of days that happen. Now, the Combine, the main event is on the Saturday where it's the physical testing, but it really is a week-long ordeal. It happens where teams will go set up shop in one of the suites in KeyBank Center and your KeyBank Arena, and they will basically it's a carousel of interviews for those prospects. So it's a great opportunity with the 100+ players that were invited to the Combine. And then they go through that interview process, talk to a lot of different guys about how many teams they interviewed with. Michael Hage from the Chicago Steel interviewed with 31 of 32 NHL teams. I mean, imagine that, going through 31 interviews in a span of a few days. I mean, that has to be mentally exhausting for a player to do that. And then you have to go do the physical testing after that. At the end of the week. But, players like that, they get a lot of these different interviews. But I wanted to give you some of the takeaways that I had, and you can also read, there's more of this and a lot more detail, as well as some of the other kind of odds and ends that I won't get to in the podcast that you can get on FloHockey.tv. Just make sure you are checking out all of our draft coverage throughout this season of the NHL draft season, where we're in June. Or yes, the Stanley Cup Finals going on. It's a big deal, but in my world, the Super Bowl is on June 28th. So really looking forward to that. And we've got a lot of coverage. So make sure you check out what I had on the Combine. But I want to give you some of the headlines that I think are going to come out of this Combine. And the first thing is what's going to happen with Ivan Demidov. And really, I don't think there's any more clarity after the Combine about the order of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and beyond. There is not consensus. I would say that the buzz is that Chicago may be leaning toward Artem Levshinov at number 2. They did take him out to dinner. They did, speak with him multiple times over the course of the season. He did his testing. He did all the stuff. There's a lot of smoke there, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything until we know more. And then Ivan Demidov was not at the Combine because players that played domestic or abroad in Russia were not invited. And so Demidov was not there. He will be at a separate camp from the Gold Star Sports Management in Florida about a week before the draft. And so Demidov will meet with teams there. So that is going to be an opportunity for him to kind of prove himself and raise his draft stock right here at the end of the very end of it. But what I got from teams and just talking to people in and around, talking to some of my fellow journalists, talking to some of the people that were with teams and just kind of the way winds are blowing, the uncertainty about Demidov in terms of him being a top 5 selection is definitely palpable. I would say that there are teams, and you always have to be careful because I do think that there is some pre-draft positioning going on. There is some, kind of smoke bomb and distraction bomb kind of throwing going on at the combine as well. But there are people in the NHL that I think are at least moderately concerned about, what the timeline is for Demidov. They don't love that he's played exclusively in the MHL. He did get an opportunity in the KHL, very minimal looks, but that's a concern. The other concern is if he doesn't make SKA out of camp next season, does he sit in the MHL for a third season, a league that he's now been a 2-time MVP of? And that is probably not ideal either developmentally, because this is a player that hasn't necessarily been challenged and you're wondering on timeline. And while there are people that think the year left on his contract, he's only under contract with SKA for one more season. If there is actually a feeling that might not be a good thing, that makes it a little less certain, because there is a feeling around the league, at least from what I gather, that SKA could pressure, or not necessarily pressure, but Demidov could want to sign an extension with SKA. I'm going to tell you right now, he is not ready to play in the NHL in 2 seasons. I mean, he could have a dramatic difference, but I mean, you can't go from the MHL to the NHL. It's just not something that happens, and it's not something that I think is feasible, even as skilled as Demidov is. But I think teams, and I don't think this is a case of overthinking it. I think this is genuine concern and in risk management by teams that are picking in the very top of this draft. Now, I still think it's less likely that Demidov slips out of the top 5. I didn't think that Matvei Mitch going to get out of the top 5 last year either, yet he did. And then it really wasn't until closer to the draft, like now, where I was like, oh, well, it sounds like he's probably going to slip. And he wouldn't get past the Flyers. And then, of course, the Flyers did end up selecting him. It's a lot harder to find where Demidov is going to end up. And we have some questions that we'll get to at the end of this show. And one of them is about one of these teams specifically. But, I think that there's all kinds of questions. What is Anaheim going to do? Pat Verbeek doesn't always do the thing that you think he's going to do. There's a little of unpredictability there. And, could they grab a Demidov if Chicago does not? And I think that there's a lot of different things that'll come into play there. What does Columbus do? Are they in a position in their organization where they're, under new management? They've got, a bunch of young players. Is this the kind of uncertainty they can throw into their future? That's another big question. Montreal, I think, is a little bit more stable in terms of what they can do. I mean, you've already got a lot of sub 6 foot, you have some sub 6 foot star players on your team. Demidov has not been officially measured by NHL Central Scouting. There is some belief that he might be bigger than 5'11", but there's also some that aren't really sure. And so with that, teams are trying to decide, and I think, Montreal is trying to decide, is that fit? And there's another reason that I think the Demidov question is a little bit more interesting, and it brings me to my next point about the Combine, and that's that I think a lot of teams are less concerned than they were before the Combine about Caden Lindstrom's health. Now, Caden Lindstrom has been among the top prospects on the board. He's been one of the guys that we've, certainly circled as a potential top 5 pick. And he, has a clean bill of health. He's been skating about 4 or 5 times a week. He said he only did 2 drills at the Combine, excuse me, as he's still trying to get himself better and fully recovered from the back injury that he sustained. But he's able to, he's medically cleared for most things. He did go out to dinner with multiple teams at the Combine. I believe Columbus, Montreal, and Utah all were among teams that took him out to dinner. Utah took out a lot of prospects, so I don't know if we can glean anything from that, but I think that the fact is that if you feel that Lindstrom has that upside, he's a 6'4" center with speed and tenacity and work ethic off the puck and all, and has skill and scoring ability, you may be a little bit more inclined to bet on that upside and that risk that comes with a player that still has some raw ability and maybe some questions about, is he a center? Is he drive play enough? Does he have the true playmaking skills to be a play driver? Does he have the hockey sense? Those things. Whereas you take the risk on so many other unknowns that are away from the ice with Demidov. So that's the other thing that kind of comes into play and makes this very interesting. I think Lindstrom could, to me, go anywhere from 2 to 6, and that I don't know that he'll go any lower than that. I feel a little bit more confident coming out of the Combine that Lindstrom is going to go very high in this draft, and that teams are less concerned about some of the things that we perceived as risks coming into this week. The other guy that's really going to disrupt things is Beckett Seneca. And that's the one that he did not test at the Combine. He is still recovering from the injury that kept him out of the OHL final. But here's the remarkable thing about Beckett Seneca. We've talked a lot about his growth spurt. He was 5'11", and then all of a sudden he's 6'2". Well, he measured at the Combine. And this was away from the eyes of the media, but was able to get that he measured in height-wise at 6 foot 2.75 inches. So he is nearly 6'3", which would be about a 4-inch growth spurt over the course of a year for him. And he still maintains a tremendous level of skill, a tremendous level of skating, and just the scoring ability that he has. And, I asked him at the Combine, what does he attribute that big jump in? And I think it was him, a combination of things. It was him getting used to his body. It was the team peaking at the right time, him peaking at the right time, and then really kind of figuring out how to put it all together. So he said, he kind of plays a bit of a small man's game in a big man's body. And that high-end skill in that size is going to be really something. And as he continues to get stronger, that's only going to get better. But he's another player that I think very well could go pretty high in the draft. And he could be one of those guys that rises it to a level that we just really weren't prepared for. And so that's really exciting as well, is that when you see a guy like him as a late riser, like we saw Cutter Gauthier last year, but I think the thing is there's that size factor, but he also has that skill. Hockey sense is there. Skating is there. Everything you need him to be at his size to be a top-end performer seems to be there. The only concern is that for the most of the regular season, he did not have a real tremendous production over the course of the OHL season. It really came later, but I think the fact that it was sustained over a long period, over basically the last 2 months of the season, is really going to say, hey, maybe he's probably more that player than what we think he could have been based on the skill situation. So I'm really excited to see where that all goes. Some of the more notable things that we saw, in terms of at the Combine, you get official measurements on players. They're measured in front of everybody. There's really no faking it. There's no listed as this is what they are. Macklin Celebrini just shy of 6 feet, and so was Cole Iserman. They have both measured in at the exact same height at 5'11.75 and 197 pounds. Zeev Buyam was at 6 feet, and that's another guy that's had a growth spurt. He was 5'10" when he left the National Team Development Program. He's now 6 foot even. That's another guy. He also crushed everybody on the pull-ups. We saw EJ Emery, which we expected to be one of the top performers at this Combine, and he was, especially when it came to the jumping drills, where it's the horizontal jump, which is a standing long jump, and the vertical jump. and he topped both of those categories by a significant margin. And we believe that he set the all-time record for the horizontal jump at 123 inches, which was nearly 4 inches further than any other player in the combine. Now, does that mean he's going to go higher in the draft? No, it does not. I promise you that physical testing is not going to materially change a team's opinion on a player unless there's something dramatic in terms of they can't do this or they can't do that. And no, I'm not talking about pull-ups, because Sam Bennett couldn't do a single pull-up. And you look at him in the Stanley Cup final right now and you say, well, that guy, he's plenty strong to play the NHL. And it really never did hold him back. He may not have been the guy that everybody thought he was going to be a top 3, but he's become a very effective NHL player. Also on the heights and weights, Dean Letourneau, the big forward, came in just shy of 6'7" at 6.6, 6'6.5". And really, I mean, talking to him, you sense the maturity, you see the different things. The big news that came out of the combine with him is he was supposed to go to the USHL next season with the Sioux Falls Stampede. However, since Will Smith signed with the San Jose Sharks, his timeline for college hockey has changed. He will be going to Boston College next season if all goes as planned. So Dean Letourneau, the big man from St. Andrews College, is a very intriguing player. And boy, was he a lot of fun to talk to as well. I really enjoyed that. Also enjoyed, you should check out, we have both their interviews up on YouTube right now. But Dean Letourneau and then also Mikhail Yegorov, for the goaltender from the Omaha Lancers, just some tremendous insight into how he thinks the position, the mental aspects of the game. He had a very tough season with Omaha, but he is a 6'5" goaltender with tremendous poise and maturity. And I mean, I kept hearing all these remarks about how remarkable his English is as well. And that's also, it's not a small thing. These players, the ability to speak English, the ability to adapt, I think that's a really important thing for some of these foreign players, because it can be very difficult for them to make that transition if there's more things that they have to go to. I mean, you think about guys like Capo Caco, it take some more time, to learn English. I think it took him time to adjust to North America. He's still, we're still waiting to see if he's going to make that full adjustment. And so I think little things like that, those are the types of things that come out of the combine where you're saying, well, hey, I know this guy a little bit better. And there are more things I know about him that make me believe that he could succeed if we pick that player. And so that's where that goes. But really tremendous couple of days in Buffalo. Always great to be there. Just the way that the NHL and NHL Central Scouting and the Harbor Center and the Buffalo Sabres, I mean, they deserve a ton of credit, because every single year it's a very easy event to cover, and it's also a very fun event to cover. And I think we learned a lot at this last one. All right, now, as we do so often, and we are going to do it more as we get closer to the draft, because I know you guys have questions, and I'm going to try my best to give you good answers. But we are going to our listener Q&A once again, and very excited to have that for you here as we dive into some of the big questions that are coming at the draft. And we start today's Q&A off with our friend Andrew. And Andrew asked, can you explain how a great combine can help a guy like Emery? Does his crazy athleticism increase the odds of him developing offense at some point? Or do scouts see him as a nice prospect, but not an indicator that there might be something more than previously thought? So it's a good question, Andrew. And I'd say that, I said it a little bit ago. I don't think that just destroying the testing is enough for a player to really move up. It doesn't tell us anything about how he plays the game of hockey. It only tells us things that we kind of already knew about him. We already knew that EJ Emery was a tremendous athlete. He played football growing up. He played a number of positions in football. His dad played football professionally. And so, that was a thing that we knew. He was a tremendous athlete that was going to exceed expectations exceed expectations on the athletic scale than most hockey players could. And he absolutely did that. What I think it also says is that for a player specifically like Emery, who also came in with a really low body fat content, that was the total body fat thing that they do with the skin folds, and he was as lean as they come. I think it really says this is a guy that has this athletic base that he's going to continue to be able to build off of. We already know he's a good skater, but this shows he's got still probably some more explosiveness he can gain with more strength. And as he gets stronger and as he's able to, adjust to that heavier weight, that's going to help a lot. So I think that it kind of confirmed more things like Emery. You see guys like Cole Beaudoin who really crushed the bench press. We already knew he was one of the physically strongest players. This only confirmed it. I think at the combine it helps to see when you see a player struggle with the horizontal jump or the vertical jump, and then you're saying, well, they're also not a very good skater. Can they build strength to get that up there? Can they? Because I think that those jumping drills really an ability to be explosive. And so to see players like a Jet Luchenko, who's a tremendous skater, he was very excellent. He did tremendously well at the lower body drills. So that helps you kind of think things through. I think that sometimes players, the other thing that teams take into account is that the players that have been done for months, their season has been over for months, they can train for all of these things. And a lot of players do. And so they train for it, and then they have an opportunity to do something and exceed in these things. But I don't think there have been very many guys that were just combine superstars that materially changed their draft stock. I think about guys like Josh Norris, who's had one of the best combine performances ever. Yeah, he turned into a serviceable NHL player. He's dealt with some injury concerns over the course of his career. Jaden Struble, who plays for the Montreal Canadiens, he was a combine standout. That was a guy that I do think, to a little bit, did help his stock a bit, just because I think there was, people were fascinated by this raw athletic kid that really had, this tremendous size, and he had a really nice college career and did well. But I think in general, these are more for confirmation and to create a baseline. And I think, every team still sends their strength and conditioning and human performance people and sports science people to these events, and they get a different level of analysis than I'm going to be able to provide you from my perch over here. But it really is fascinating that, there are all these, but I really think the medical testing, some of the physiological testing that is done away from the eyes of the media, the results that get sent to teams, those are the things that are more important. Because I remember there were players like, I remember hearing, Elias Pettersson. There were some concerning things that came back on the physiological side that made teams a little bit hesitant to take him earlier in the draft. And so that's, but he still went very early. So but it was one of those things where I heard teams say, hey, like this is a concern. They were worried about, hey, he might be injury prone, different things like that. But as we've seen, he's had injuries, but he's been a fine NHL player. All right, let's go to our next one. And this one comes to us from EMAC, and he asks, what combine stats actually matter? Does it vary based on play styles? What's an example of a number that shocked you? The two kids with 3.5% body fat as well. Not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And Eric, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing either. I'm really not sure because I think, certainly, we knew that. And the two kids that had that was EJ Emery and Sam Dickinson, that had that low body fat content. And I think it's there's a lot of lean muscle on both of those guys. So I don't think it's a real concern, but two of the best pure athletes in this draft, I think, too, with Emery and Dickinson. But, I think the numbers that do matter, I do think, things like, we're not necessarily concerned about how well a player does on the VO2 max, but sometimes there's that competitiveness that comes out. And so Cole Beaudoin had the longest ride in the bike test, went over like almost 14 minutes on the bike and cleared, I think, everybody else by about 30 seconds on the bike. That there's like, hey, that shows a little bit of his fitness level, which we already knew was great. But there's that drive, that willingness to fight through it. You watch guys battle for that every inch on the pull-ups. Z Buyam had the most of anybody with 16 pull-ups, and I think that's those things help. But really, there isn't a number on there that I see that matters. What really does matter is sometimes those heights and weights and those different things of saying, hey, confirming or denying what's been listed or what hasn't been effectively measured. And you see a guy like a Gabriel Eliasson coming in at nearly 6'7", 6'6" and 3/4, And that, you're like, wow, and he has really good mobility for a player of that size. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to go much higher in the draft, but it's like, oh, it just, confirms things for teams and gives you a little bit more insight. Aaron Kiviharyu, he's been listed often at 5'10", 5'11". He's 5'9.5" according to the measurements here. So that 1 inch makes a huge difference in the eyes of the NHL, because it does kind of change the dynamic of, the probabilities of a player that's X height, X weight at this age, and how they translate into the NHL when there are other questions to be asked as well. All right, let's go to some less combine related and more draft order related. And this one comes to us from the Gargoyle, and it's a good follow up because things often do change after this combine. I asked the podcast a while ago about Montreal at 5. Does Demidov at 5 seem more or less likely after the combine? I think, based on what I'm hearing, I feel like there's a good possibility that he will be there. I think there's a good possibility that Ivan Demidov is going to be available at 5. I think there's a chance that Montreal is going to have a decision to make at 5, but I think that decision is probably going to include Demidov. And now, if you remember last year's draft, and I know the Gargoyle does because he's asking from the Montreal standpoint, Matvei Michkov was there. Montreal opted to take David Reinbacher instead, and now you're taking this similar approach. Demidov will be there. There will be talented defensemen available. There will be some of the best forwards available. What are you going to do? And that is going to be a very, very interesting decision from Kent Hughes and his staff, because I do think Demidov is going to be one of those options. And if he is, it is a tough call for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. But I'm fascinated to see what they do. I think that Montreal, certainly holds a lot of keys to where the draft goes from there with their decision, because really that's what we're trying to figure out. And I think a lot of the teams at the top of the draft, either they're not 100% sure yet which is their guy, or they're not sure who everybody else is looking at. And that's the other thing that kind of comes into play. So a lot of gamesmanship this time of year, but based on what I'm hearing, I do think that Demidov could be there. All right, let's go to the Columbus Blue Jackets and Marshall. Marshall asks, what's your best guess on the CBJ draft board order, and how likely do you believe it is they trade the pick? Ooh, interesting. Well, I think the pick trades, that's probably, and I try to offer some opinion on it because I think that there's some level of insight, but I think that Columbus and anybody that is picking in that range, it would have to be a knock your socks off offer to go and move that pick. And that's the thing, because right now Montreal is in a position where they're going to get one of the best defensemen in the draft or one of the best forwards in the draft, and going to be really, really happy with what they come away with. And so at number 4, I can't give you an order. I don't know what the order is going to be for Columbus, but I do think that Caden Lindstrom is very much in the mix at 4. I think if he's still on the board, that would be a very tempting pick for them. You think about the direction they went with Adam Fantilli, getting the big, strong center. You can add some more size and skill to your lineup with a Caden Lindstrom. I think they have to consider the defensemen that are going to be available in that range. Dickinson, for sure. Silayev, for sure. I think even the smaller puck moving guys like Parekh and Zeev Buyum could be in play there. There's just a lot of options available to them, and it depends. If Chicago and somebody else decides not to take Levshinov, then that becomes an interesting decision as well. And so I think that Columbus right now, it would probably have to be a mega offer to move off of that, because I do think you're getting another franchise cornerstone style player with this pick. And that's what you need as you continue to grow as an organization under new management and with, a new direction at the top of your organization. You got to start making some of these long-term plays. And I do think that stuff like this, where you have the high pick, is an opportunity to do some more damage on a prospect pool that has pieces. It's not an empty cupboard there. They have some real good prospects in their system, but you can always use more. And I think they're going to be able to get a real good one there. All right, we've got a couple of questions here at number 5, and I'm going to read them both to you because they kind of follow the same train of thought. The first one's from Matapumo, and asks, from Owen Power through present, how would you rank Levshinov's potential compared to the D just taken in the top 5 since the Power draft? And then Easy Ev also asks, where would you slot Levshinov as a prospect in a group that of the following players? Owen Power, Simon Nemec, Jake Sanderson, Rasmus Dahlin, essentially the top defensemen from their draft years. Well, the way I do this is I think about it in terms of where those players were as prospects. And I think, you go back and Rasmus Dahlin was far and away the number one guy in his class among defensemen. And then you see later that, well, actually, Quinn Hughes was probably the best defenseman from that class. And you could redraft and do whatever you want. But you think about those different things. And Dahlin, as a prospect, however, I had him as a number one pick. I think that the offensive game is exceptional. And, there's probably a lot of similarities between Dahlin and Levshinov in terms of their skill set and ability to produce and things like that. But if I'm going to take Easy Evs because it gives me a little bit more direction here with these players. And, for me, I saw both Owen Power and Artem Levshinov at the same age in the USHL. And to me, Levshinov was more impressive at that point. I saw both of them play their freshman season in college. And I think that Levshinov was decisively more impressive than Owen Power as a freshman. And I thought Owen Power was exceptional as a freshman. I thought he was a number one draft prospect there as well. So to me, Levshinov would be, Dahlin would probably go 1. Levshinov would be in the mix there. I was very high on Jake Sanderson, and I still am. And I think it's hard not to use hindsight as well with Sanderson. So I think that we would be talking about Levshinov right in the middle of that group, ahead of both Power and Nemec decisively for me, somewhere along the same lines as a Dahlin and Sanderson. Because I think if you recall Jake Sanderson's freshman or his season, draft season, the production wasn't amazing, and there were some concerns about his skill and his hockey sense offensively. As we've seen in the pros, not really a huge issue. Is he as dynamic as some players? Like, that's the thing. I think Levshinov is the more dynamic of the two players in terms of his hand skills and the different things he can do offensively, whereas Jake Sanderson was a far better defender than really anybody of anyone on that list. No one is close to Jake Sanderson on the defensive side of the puck. And so that's the other thing, is that I think Jake Sanderson is probably the most well-rounded defenseman we've seen at the very top of the draft in the last few years, which is why I would keep him a little bit ahead of Levshinov. But Levshinov, right in the middle of that group, we're talking about a cornerstone number one defenseman. All of these guys are going to be number one defensemen. Probably with Nemec is the one that I'm not as convinced about. And I would also, I'd throw Luke Hughes ahead of him, and I had him ahead of him in the draft. I had Juracek ahead of him as well. So he's really not in the conversation among any of those guys for me at this point, as good as he was in his rookie season. So with Levshinov, I think you're talking about a guy that's right there with on a tier with Dahlin and Sanderson, and I have no problem saying that. I think he's a special player. All right, now this is a tough question coming to us from Flyers Jabroni, and be nicer to yourself. You're no jabroni. What would you define the Russian factor as? And this is a good question because I think that a lot of people think about the Russian factor in a number of ways. And now there is a Russian factor that is of old. And the Russian factor of old is steeped in stereotypes, steeped in bad experiences with some players and forgetting about all the good experiences with other players. And I think there was a hesitancy among NHL general managers for a period of time to select Russian players higher because of some perceived issues, whether it be character, cultural, things like that. So those are kind of some of the things that are in the mix in the Russian factor of old. That has changed. I think teams have come to learn these Russian players really from a standpoint. Once you get to know the player, the drive is the same, the skill level is there. All the different things, they want the same things. They want If they are the best Russian players, they want to play in the NHL, they want to succeed in the NHL, and they want to, win Stanley Cups. The Russian factor now is far more complicated and far more involved than that old stereotypical Russian factor. What it is now is there is the factor of how soon can we get a player out of Russia? How easy is it going to be to get a player that, it that will have pressures to stay? And we look at, Matvey Michkov had a long contract. Anton Silayev has multiple years left on his contract. Ivan Demidov has 1 year, but there's that concern that he might re-sign with SKA and then you don't see him for a few years. You look at what the Carolina Hurricanes have gone through with Nikishin, who is probably the best defenseman outside of the NHL by a substantial margin. Has been one of the best defensemen in the KHL. And it's just like, as soon as he comes over, the expectation is immediate impact for him on the Carolina Hurricanes. But they've been waiting years and years for that now. And because of that, and because of the external political pressures that some of these players face in wanting to or needing to stay home, there is a lot that you have to try and kind of sort through because of that. So it's tough. It really is. Tough to define because I think that these players, they want to play in the NHL, but it's not as simple as wanting to play in the NHL. If they are not going to, the other thing that teams consider is that if this player is not going to make our NHL team immediately, there is very little chance they are going to accept extended time in the AHL. We have seen that with a few different players over the years where basically their NHL team said, we need you to go to the AHL for a while. And they said, well, I'm going back to the KHL if that's the case. And then they do. And then it's another waiting period. The other thing that there are so many, I keep saying the other thing because there is a lot of other things that kind of come into it. Another factor that teams consider is that, hey, once we get this player, we're going to have minimal contact with him. We won't be able to have any control over their development. We won't have any insight into how things are going, beyond what we see on video. It's not like, you can send your player development guy into Russia right now. And it's not always been the case that the Russian team would be receptive to an NHL person coming in to work with a player. And so those are now the Russian factors, if you will, that you have to consider when drafting a Russian player. The fact that there's really no firm transfer agreement between the NHL and the KHL, I think, also plays a role. I think the leagues have kind of tried to honor each other's contracts, although we saw with Ivan Fedotov, which created a whole firestorm that we never really anticipated. But in a nutshell, and it's a huge nutshell, I guess, with a lot of different moving parts, to me, that's how I define the Russian factor. It's complicated. All right, let's go to our next question. This one comes from Aaron. Aaron asks, Chris, how does a player who finishes top 10 in NCAA points, wins the Natty, wins the World Juniors, and does not go in the top 5? Why is Buyam not being considered a top pick? Well, Aaron, I think he is being considered a top pick by NHL teams. It is not out of the question that he goes within the top 5. It's not out of the question that he goes within the top 8. It's not out of the question that he falls out of the top 10. It's just the way things kind of work out. Basically, all the things that you mentioned, those are all amazing things. They're tremendous things, but the draft isn't about what you're doing right now. It's about what we think you can do in 5 years. If you're an NHL team and you see the difference between a Zeev Buyam and either a Sam Dickinson or a Anton Silayev or an Artem Levshinov, you're saying, wow, they do a lot of things, but they do them in a bigger package. They do them in a bigger body. That can matter. However, I think a lot of teams are taking a look at Zeev Buyam and saying, this is a dynamically skilled player. This is a highly intelligent player. This is a player that has dramatically improved his defensive play over the year. This is a guy that has been a winner at every level. And so, yes, I think there is consideration for Zeev Buium in the top 5. I think for a lot of us, it just comes down to who has the most upside of these players. And I think you can look at a Dickinson, you can look at a Silayev and a Levshinov, and you say, well, the probability of them being successful NHL players might be higher than that of Zeev Buium. But then I just talked about Rasmus Dahlin going ahead of Quinn Hughes. Quinn Hughes went later in the first round and now is starting to look like he could be the best defenseman on his draft. He's going to win the Norris Trophy, so that's where, you say, okay, well, Zeev definitely deserves to be considered in that group because he had a better freshman season than Quinn Hughes did. He had a better freshman season than anybody had ever had. And so he is considered a top pick. It's just a matter of preference, which teams are there, fit, but it's possible. And I think it'll be interesting to see, considering the uncertainty of, Demidov, if there are any teams that are still concerned about the injury issues with Lindstrom, if there are any teams that aren't sold on the rise of Beckett Seneca, we could be talking about a very early pick for Zeev Buium. And I think he'd be worth it. So we'll see where he goes. He was 6 on my board. And I certainly have a lot of time for the player, and I think he's going to be a special prospect as well. All right. Here's the other next question that we're going to go to. Sorry if it's just losing my train of thought for a minute. These are a lot of questions. This comes from Van Ginkels Kachuk. I hope that that's not something that shouldn't be saying. I don't know. It's interesting. Interesting username. There has been little to no rumors about my beloved Ottawa Senators. Please fill the void. Would Iginla or Yakimchuk be possible targets for Steve Staios and company? Who goes in that range? Well, tough to answer. Obviously, there's been a lot of change in the Ottawa Senators over the last year, so I think that's part of the reason why some of the rumors aren't coming out. People are still kind of feeling each other out in terms of the reporting and context of all that. A lot of the same scouts are still there. They've had a long time scouting staff in Ottawa with a lot of guys with a lot of experience. Real wild card. The Senators are because of where they sit in the draft as well. And I think Yakimchuk and Iginla are both absolutely options for Ottawa. And I think that they should, they have to consider all of their options at this point. But I think as you look at the draft board and you say, okay, well, where are things going to lie? I mean, there's just so much uncertainty ahead of them. And I think that's why we're seeing fewer and fewer options or fewer and fewer rumors, because really there's no consensus. There's just not. We knew last year, which players were going to go. And I think there's consensus in like the top 15 prospects of this draft, but there's no consensus in the order that they're going to go in, which I think is really makes it really hard for the position that Ottawa is in at 7, where everyone kind of has to clear out. But I think, at 7, there's still a strong likelihood that Iginla will be there. There's still a strong likelihood that Yakimchuk will be there. There's a chance that one of Zane Parekh or Zeev Buium would be there. So picking at 7, let everybody else make the decisions in front of you and take the next best player. And I think that's basically what Ottawa is going to do, regardless of position. And I think that that's something that they'll consider very strongly, is that, we're going to take the best player that we can here and continue to build and get more skilled. And you're going to be able to do that. I mean, I think like Berkeley Catton, for instance, is another player that I think has a lot of fans in the scouting community, even though he is under 5'11". And I think that that's going to be another player that a lot of teams are going to take a long look at in that top 8, top 9. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. Yakimchuk, to me, is one of the real wild cards because he's a 6'3" right shot defenseman with the ability to play with tremendous skill, scored 30 goals this season. Doesn't always make the best decisions, doesn't always defend well, but he competes and he's physical and he's aggressive. And so to me, that's another guy that just really could disrupt things in this draft and makes sense there for them as well. I mean, you want to have more guys. And Yakimchuk told us, he's really tried to model his game after Evan Bouchard. You see Evan Bouchard in the way that he's played in the Stanley Cup playoffs this year, and you say, wow, if you can get a player like that, you've got a chance to really boost your offensive game from the back end. And so that's why he makes a lot of sense. And then meanwhile, Tisha Ginla, you hear him all over the place, really. And because of that, because you hear him every which way, you don't know if he's going to be there. You don't know if he's going to get past 4 or 6. You just really don't know. And so, excuse me, I think that he's going to be possibly there. And I think for the Senators, 7 is still a great place to land an impact prospect. And that's what I think they're going to get, regardless of who they pick. But if it's either of those two players, I think you're going to be really happy. All right. Our next question comes from Mike. And Mike asks, if the Bruins jump into the later portion of the first round because of a Linus Ullmark trade, who are some guys that you think they should target? I think the Bruins are one of those teams where there's just so many needs. You don't look at position. You don't look at, you just look at who's going to be the best player available there. And, I don't know what an Ullmark trade is going to bring. I don't know exactly how high they're going to be able to get themselves in the draft and what it's going to take for them to, be more of a player in this whole press. But if they are able to get a first out of the deal, I mean, what a tremendous possibility that could be. You get what you get, basically. I think you look at guys like a Cole Eiserman and his goal scoring talent, or can you get that high to get a player like that if you're a little bit further down in the first round? I think I look at guys like Sasha Boisvert from the Muskegon Lumberjacks, who I think is a really talented late round player. Michael Hage with tremendous speed. Another player like him, Jet Luchenko, who I think has really risen this year, tremendously skilled, and comes from the Guelph Storm and has done a lot of really good things and plays on both sides of the puck and has tremendous scoring ability. So, I think those are some names that you throw out there, but without really knowing what a Linus Ullmark trade will fetch, it's hard to say. But I think that if you're the Bruins, you'd love to get in the first round of this draft because there are enough players that could excite you. And certainly that's a team that, you get some of those bigger players, some more skill. You're happy about that. So we'll see where that goes. But I mean, it really depends. And I do think that we could see some activity on the trade front, based on what we're hearing. I think the teams are trying to move things around, reposition themselves, and are saying, hey, if we can get a lot better for multiple years, we will make that trade with a draft pick involved. All right, let's go to our next question. This one comes from Clark, and Clark asks, who or what do you prioritize if you were in charge of the Penguins draft? The Pittsburgh Penguins, oft maligned because of their lack of prospects, but have to be feeling good about Braden Yeager. And I think that's a player that'll be a top prospect in basically any organization. But I think you look at where the Penguins sit right now, and they just don't have a lot of draft capital in order to to make a big splash. They've got those second round picks, and so basically with that, you're at the mercy of the board. Can you package those second rounders to get back into the first round to get the guy that you really want? I think that's always a possibility. But you look at some of the options, later rounds, late second round, I think defense, Owen Pickering is a fine defensive prospect. Is he a top tier guy? I don't necessarily know. So if you look and you say, okay, what kind of defense can we get? Is there somebody in the early second round that we're going to be able to get some really good, some juice out of in terms of upside? I think that's certainly possible. But you're not looking at positions. You're not looking at anything because, quite frankly, the Penguins need everything in their system. They've got some unique players. They've got some guys that are going to help, but they don't have a lot of it. And so finding players wherever you can at this point is really important. So I know it's an unsatisfying answer because really right now the Penguins are kind of in an unsatisfying position where they, miss the playoffs. They are kind of in the mushy middle of the NHL at the moment. And you don't have a lot of draft capital to show for it either. Having lost the number 14 pick, which I think would have been able to land you one of the better tier, better talents of this draft, given where I think the drop off comes, which is not far off after that pick. All right, our next question comes from MV Pete, and he asks to rank these hockey skills by order of difficulty to improve on: skating, puck skills, hockey sense, compete, and shot. Well, I really do think that hockey sense is the toughest to train because it really only comes with repetition. It only comes with opportunities to play and see a lot of different things. And the thing is it takes the longest to develop because as players get older, the hockey sense does get better. And it's just because their experience gets better. And so that's one where you can't really rush the process. You either have it or you don't at a young age. And then there are ways to train it. There are drills to do. And there are certainly, everybody's been trying to, sell different options of how to train hockey sense. But to me, it's one of those things where, it's very difficult to teach. It's very difficult to learn, and it's very difficult to hone. And it's something that really takes a long time. So to me, that's number one and the most difficult. Number two, I do think that skating has become a very difficult trait to excel in, and it is such a critical piece of a player's game. And in the modern NHL, skating ability is important, but it is trainable. It's something that is there. And so I think that is improving in terms of, there are a lot of skating coaches that are finding ways to improve skating, but I do think it's very difficult to add 2 or 3 steps to your skating stride. It just doesn't seem to happen. And there's obviously physiological things that control your skating. There's muscular things. There's just so much that goes into it. But you can work out and different things like that. The shot, I think, next is compete, because I think that's another thing where it's very difficult to train. It's kind of an either you have it or you don't kind of thing. You have to want to do it. I think some players develop it later when they kind of get some of that older wisdom, and they're like, if I want to keep my job, I have to play harder. I have to do more. The skill isn't going to get me by. And that's something that I think will come with time, similar to hockey sense. So that's another thing. But I do think that it's something that any player can improve on, because it's, for some of them, it really is a matter of flipping a switch and getting to the point where I have to play harder, because that is something you can turn around. But again, I think that some players just either have it or they don't. The puck skills are to be at a high level, very difficult. But I think that there is more and more skills training than there's ever been before. We're seeing more players get better with their puck handling. They're getting more creative with it. They're doing things that are within their abilities, as opposed to trying to, make up stuff. They're doing things that are within their capabilities and finding out ways to maximize those capabilities. So I think that's the next thing. And then in terms, I think the shot is one of those things where it's not, it takes time, but shoot. It is muscle memory. It is, figuring out and experimenting with different release points, different things about your stick. So I think, to me, that's one of the things that's probably the easiest overall to train in the end, because it's all about, practice and repetition, and then you eventually get better in that regard. So hopefully, to just recap, it goes hockey sense, skating, compete, puck skills, and then shot. So there you go. That's the order in which I think they're hardest to easiest to learn and get better. All right. Our next question comes from Charger J, and Charger J asks, at 30th overall, do you think the Rangers can find value, or would they be better off dealing it for immediate help? Well, I don't think the 30th pick is going to carry a whole lot of value to get immediate help. We very rarely see the first round pick trade this close to the draft when we know the number of the pick, and especially when that pick is in the 30s, because there's not a ton of difference between that 30th pick and a team that might have seconds. Where that 30th pick could be valuable is in trading back and getting more second round picks, getting more, players that, we have a group of guys that we think will be available, and if we can get both of these guys, we'll be really happy. That's an option. I don't think that the 30th pick is going to bring in immediate help. So I know that's, again, an unsatisfying answer, but it's also, the pick values from basically 25 back can really vary team to team. Unless there's a team out there that really, really, really likes a player that's still available at 30 and they're willing to part with something of value. I just don't think that those types of trades really materialize frequently on the draft floor. All right, our next question comes from Jesse. And Jesse asks, Chris, who is going to be this year's Dmitry Simashev, the player who gets drafted a good bit earlier than expected? Well, I talked about him a little bit earlier, and I think Carter Yakimchuk is one of those real wild card guys who, he's one of on a lot of the lists, he's the last defenseman listed. But I think that there is a chance that he could go ahead of Zeev Buyum and Zane Parekh. I think there's a chance he could even go ahead of Sam Dickinson. He's the one of those guys where if a team likes him enough, he has those tools that are really exciting and enticing. I personally think that I feel comfortable with where I have him slotted based on some of my concerns about his overall hockey sense. And then I think also at the physical training we saw, there are some limitations in his athleticism right now. And it's something that he's going to need to work on. But I really think that his skating has come along quite well. I really like his footwork. I think that his puck skills are outstanding. He's got a great shot. He gets into the play very well. He's physical and has some nastiness to him, which I think speaks to teams. So that's the guy. I think, a big right shot defenseman with skill very well could go higher than most of us have looked at him as. And I also think the other guy is Beckett Seneca. I think he's really got a chance to sneak into that top 5 based on what we're seeing and the growth spurt and everything else. He's a really exciting player, and I think teams are going to be looking to draft him pretty early. All right, our next question comes to us from Mitchell. And Mitchell says, I'm always curious how late risers and late sliders end up performing over the course of their career. It varies, obviously. I think there's a lot of players over the years that have really jumped into those draft conversations and they do great. And there are others that don't. I think, you look right now, sometimes it comes down to injury and different things like that. Nobody really saw some of the things that happened in these recent drafts that I always go back to. Came into his draft season as a top 5 prospect. Did not go until the second round. I believe he was 43rd overall. And that is Brandon Saad. And Brandon Saad is one of those players that I said many times in that draft year, because I was at the National Team Development Program his last year, his 1 year there. I was like, this is a man child, and that's basically what he became in the NHL. For whatever reason, slipped down the draft boards. He dealt with injury throughout that season. I think that there was some character, red flags that people threw out there that I always thought were a little bit overblown. And then you look at what Brandon Saad has done. He's won multiple Stanley Cups. He's been a contributor throughout his career. He's, frequently he wasn't going to be that top 5 quality guy, but he's definitely should have gone in the first round that year. A lot of players that went never really amounted to anything in the NHL, and he's had a nice long career. And so, those are, you could cherry pick all sorts of things like that. These late risers, these late, but there's also been some where the jury's still out. I'm thinking, Pavel Mintyukov had a really great rookie season. I think he was a late riser in his draft year. That's pretty solid. The jury's going to still be out on a guy like Brad Lambert, who slipped. Atu Ratu, those guys, we still have to wait and see. Those are guys that fell down the draft board as well. But, I think those guys are really interesting. And then, Cutter Gauthier, who went, we don't know what he's going to be as an NHL player, but we do know as a college player, he's one of the top goal scorers in college hockey over 2 seasons. And he was one of those guys that was a really late riser. So we'll have to see where that all goes. But I think, guys like Beckett Seneca, really intriguing. But you always kind of take those late risers, those late fallers, and you maybe do keep your eye on them because to see how it all pans out and see if we were right all those months ago, or if we were right at the end, or if none of it was right. You never really know. All right. Our last question today is coming from Alex, and Alex asks, any opinion on the 32 thoughts comment about potentially limiting the draft to 4 rounds? What difference does that make to players who would have been chosen with later picks? Any real difference between starting as a free agent and becoming one at 20 or at 22 plus like they would in the NCAA? Really good question, Alex. And I actually haven't had a chance to listen to the 32 Thoughts episode about this very topic. However, I did learn a little bit more about it. And this is really being driven by the agents right now. And I understand why. And let me tell you why. Because their concern is that these teams get team control of a player that's going on the NCAA track. They will get that player under contract until the 4 years of college. So that is a long period of time to retain a player's rights. That player can't go work out with other teams, can't be seen by other teams. And so as a result, they kind of get lost in the shuffle. They're still scouted because teams send their pro scouts to college games. They send amateur scouts to college games. A lot of them have NCAA specific scouts, and they're going and they're looking for those players that are potentially going to become free agents. We've also seen in recent years, plenty of players have allowed that four-year gap to lapse and then become free agents. And so it gives them some choice. The other thing is it does kind of create an uneven playing field on the free agent situation. There are much more NCAA players that are getting signed as free agents than there are as CHL players that are not getting picked, that are not getting signed after their age 20 season. The reason is, quite frankly, we've got 2 more years of data on those players, sometimes 3 or 4 more years of data on those players, and have a better idea of what they could be as professionals. And so those guys as free agents do get a greater opportunity to be seen, to get those deals, to get into an NHL organization. Now, only a fraction of those players will pan out and become full-time NHL players. Many more will be long-time AHL players, or some won't pan out at all and will end up going somewhere else. So that's part of it as well. What it means in terms of the draft, like I'm not a huge fan of this, even though I completely understand the rationale behind it. What I think about this is that the draft is what it is. I mean, like, if you can make these changes, it's not going to really change things for me. I don't think it's going to change things for players, because I think there are some players that believe I'd rather not get picked than picked in the 7th round and have my choice later on. So, like, you look at a guy like a Frank Vetrano, doesn't get drafted, spends a couple years in college, and then was able to choose his destination, and was just so happened to be the team that he grew up rooting for in the Boston Bruins. They signed him out of UMass, and he gets this opportunity. And so that's an advantageous situation for him. If he would have been drafted in the 7th round, he might have been drafted by a team that had no intention of signing him, and then he doesn't get that opportunity until his 4 years have passed for his draft rights. So that's the other thing. But I do think, in terms of, to me, 4 years for a lot of these players isn't going to make a huge difference, and that they're still going to be seen. I don't think that there's really anything that would prevent them from, eventually searching things out as a free agent. It might cost them a year or two of professional hockey, which is unfortunate, but at the same time, it's just kind of the way that the thing works. But yeah, I mean, I don't think in the end this would end up impacting a ton of players. Yeah, it's a tricky situation. It's one that I want to dive in more. I want to try to get into the mind frame of some of the agents a little bit more on this. I don't think that NHL teams would necessarily be in favor of this. I also don't think the NHL would necessarily be in favor of this. I do think that the draft is an important event, and to shorten the draft is probably not ideal, especially when you have so many. You only have 50 contracts a year that you can give out. And so it does create that additional level of strategy. But I think the freedom of player movement is always something we talk about. And really, I think about it this way too. Every level of hockey has this draft, and it's to create some level of competitive balance among the teams. You don't, and to me, that's where this kind of debate really falls on, is that the drafts exist to create some level of competitive balance, because otherwise the teams with the most money would get, and the most favorable position would always get the best players, and then you're not seeing the equal distribution of talent, and that's not good for the league, quite frankly. It's not good for the product. It is good for the individual players. There is more freedom, there's more choice, there's all those things, and I think that that's an important thing. But I'm also thinking about, hey, this is preservation of the product is also important. And if the product continues to, if you're only giving X amount of players this opportunity within the draft, and then X amount of players become free agents, we're talking about a completely different dynamic of team building going forward. And now you've lessened the importance of the draft, and you've created a higher level of benefit on the recruiting side for the teams that are more advantageous in the recruiting side. The big cities, the American markets, the warm weather places, all of a sudden have different advantages in a larger free agent pool. So it's something that I hope maybe in the offseason we can dig into a little bit more. Obviously, as I said, I didn't hear the episode yet of where that is. I plan to listen to it, but I saw this question. I want to include it on the show because I think that it is a discussion worth having, and it obviously is being had right now among the agents. But I think that my sense is that the league would be reluctant for something like this, but I do think it would be interesting to see how it impacts things going forward and how far this actually gets. But I do think a 4-round NHL draft would be too short and a little boring and probably not good for what I do. But either way, whatever you guys do, we'll still keep watching the prospects. So we'll figure it out. But anyway, that's going to do it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for asking these great questions. Gives us a lot to think about. We're going to continue these Q&A episodes as we get closer to the draft. We are only weeks away now from Las Vegas. I will be there. I cannot wait to be there. Cannot wait to cover this draft for you, and cannot wait to bring you so much more coverage on FloHockey. We are going to have plenty more. If you go to FloHockey.tv, just check out on that top bar. You'll see NHL draft. You'll see all the videos in the combine. You'll see our draft rankings. You'll see every piece of content I'm producing for you leading up to the draft. There will be much, much more, including some mock drafts coming up. Oh yeah, we're talking mock drafts once again. We'll have another one. It's going to be a lot of fun, a lot more to get to, and get you prepped for this NHL draft. A reminder, please leave a kind rating and review on your podcast app of choice and keep those downloads coming. And I want to give a huge thanks to everyone that's listening, everyone that asked questions. Thanks to Nikki, who's producing today's episode. And thank you all for joining us on today's episode. We will be back next week with much more on the NHL draft. My name is Chris Peters. This is Talking Hockey Sense. We'll catch you next time.